Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones. Great to be with you today. Thanks for your patience as we had just a slight delay in getting started. Glad to be back together in this translation notes webinar. This is Mark 13:28 through 31, and 4 verses in this chapter. Maybe feels like a lot, but I think we'll get through it, in part because I don't think there are really super significant or challenging translation issues, and also in part because some of the challenging interpretive issues which come up again here are ones we've addressed before. And so we can just dip back into those briefly, but we will focus today, as we do in this series, on the lexical and grammatical questions that arise when translating from Greek to English. So I've noted at the beginning of every one of these webinars, and just want to say again that we have many webinars that are feature focused, including the search series that I've just wrapped up. This one is more focused on translation questions, especially at the word level and maybe at the clause level. Why is this participle here? What is this word doing in this place? So I want to make sure that you can access the handout, which you should be seeing on my screen, and that you can hear me. Let me just make sure that I've got Accordance up and running. We will be in Accordance the whole time today. And the handout has the guide for what we're doing. So let me just check in with you and see if you've got comments or questions or any needs before we get started. And I'm going to try to get Accordance to not crash. I don't know what is going on with that. Let me just take a moment here. Okay, there we go. All right, good as new. So Mark 13:28 through 31. We are recording today, and so you'll be able to go back and watch this afterwards. If you have registered, you'll automatically get a link to the recording. This handout is available in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar control panel. And you can also access it at this link here, tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. And so if you're watching this on a recording later and looking for the handout, this is probably the easiest place to go. You can also email me if you like. All right, so last time, Mark 13:24 through 27, Jesus' speech continues through the chapter. And this was a couple weeks ago, we had this. He says, "But in those days after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send the angels, and he will gather his chosen from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." And we spent some time going through that, both at the word and sentence level, and then also at the level of meaning. We talked about the Son of Man imagery, and I suggested, although we didn't pursue, directions for researching this further as it comes up in Daniel 7. Now we shift gears a little bit. He tells a parable, Jesus does, and we're going to go to that now in Mark 13:28. Let me just close my Safari, go to Accordance. Here we go. So I'll open up a Greek text, which is open to my last spot, which is Mark 13:28. Let's start here. Apo de te sukes mathete tein parabolein. So that would be something like from the fig tree, learn the parable. Hatan ede ha kladas autes, whenever already its branch, hapalas, is tender, genitai, kai ekfue tafula, and when sprout the leaves, or when the leaves come out, genoskete hati engus tatheras estin. You know that near the summer is. All right, let's get that into a smoother translation. From the fig tree, learn this lesson. And I did not translate the day here, this post-positive, and that's okay, but I think I actually might go back and revise that if I were to do a revised translation. So you could say, now from the fig tree, learn this lesson, which is, again, to indicate some level of transition. And the way that we indicate that in our translations most often is through a paragraph, a new paragraph. Now, from the fig tree, learn this lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and it puts out its leaves, you know that the summer is near. Let's start with the first phrase, apo de te sukes mathete ten parabolein. From the fig tree, learn this, or it's really learn the lesson. And I note here in terms of word order, from the fig tree is a fronted prepositional phrase. In English, and I think for that matter in Greek, more often than not, you would see the prepositional phrase come after the subject and the verb that it's supporting or modifying. Here it's fronted, and usually that's to bring the listener's focus to a phrase. It can be for emphasis. Different translations treat this differently. Some say, well, let's put this in a word order that is most natural English, and so you'll have some translations say, learn this lesson from the fig tree. Personally, my own translation philosophy is whenever possible, actually most translation philosophies are this way, we want to preserve as much as possible of the Greek text and bring it right into English. Now, we know that's not always possible, like with idioms and word order that just doesn't translate from one language to another, but I think in this case, you can bring over that fronted prepositional phrase just fine. From the fig tree, learn this lesson. It's as if Jesus is saying, hey, remember the fig tree? Or think about the fig tree, or imagine a fig tree. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about it. So I keep that fronted there. And we just get the definite article tes for the fig tree, tes sukes. And in English and in Greek, there are different ways to understand the definite article. Now, that may sound funny because in a sense, a is the indefinite article, and different ways of understanding it sounds more like indefinite. Definite sounds pretty clear. It's like the one thing. So we want to ask, does that mean, does Jesus have a specific fig tree in mind, like the fig tree? But the can also be kind of stand in. If I were to say, consider the sparrow, how it sings in spring, you are likely to call to mind a sparrow. You are not likely to expect that I have one specific sparrow in mind. Like I may not be talking about the sparrow that I just saw in my neighbor's yard yesterday, and you wouldn't even think about that, probably. You would just think about a sparrow. But in Greek, as in English, the way that we say this is not consider a sparrow, although you could, but consider the sparrow. So that definite article, even though it's called definite, it can be, I guess generic is that word, like it's talking about the kind of thing, which is the fig tree. So that's one question to ask, is when Jesus says the fig tree, is he talking about the fig tree more generally, or is he talking about a specific fig tree? Now, this is the only reason I'm spending this much time on this question is because there was a significant fig tree in Mark 11. So we at least want to look at this question, and we can do it pretty easily in accordance. We can select a word, right click, search for lexeme. This is the genitive form because of apo, from, which is taking the genitive here. And so if we search for inflected, we would get all genitives. The tes also tips us off, but we want to search for the lexeme. We want to see suke in any inflection, in any case. So here's the lexeme. Accordance fills out the syntax with an equal sign in the lexical form. And so here it is in the accusative, here it is in the nominative, genitive, and so on. You've got 16 uses. You're right at Mark already. You could also jump ahead to Mark here, or you could just keyboard shortcut or start typing range and Mark. And we've done that for a number of searches. So here is a fig tree in Mark 11, and we may look at this some more and see whether Jesus has this specific fig tree in mind. It seems like maybe he doesn't, because in Mark 13, he's saying whenever its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves. And that was certainly true of this fig tree at one time, but there's a withering that happens in Mark 11. So presumably, barring some sort of fig tree resuscitation, that fig tree is out of the picture. So it's at least worth exploring this, but I don't think Jesus is talking about that specific fig tree in Mark 11. I think the is a more general, like this example I've given here, consider the sparrow. Or if you think about like a nature documentary, like, look at the kangaroo and how it kicks its would-be predators or something like that. So you could search that. I think it's worth doing. We have that fig tree imagery in Mark 11. I think it's worth considering how that connects in meaning to this passage. But I would simply translate it, the fig tree, with the definite article, and have this understanding that this is, I think, more likely a kind of general fig tree. And in fact, what reinforces that conclusion for me is the rest of the verse. Jesus goes on to say, from the fig tree, learn this parable, hatan ede, whenever it gives, whenever its branch becomes tender, whenever it puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So that sounds like just a kind of cyclical thing. It could be any fig tree. It doesn't matter which fig tree you see with the tender branch and leaves budding. You only have to see one, whichever one it is, to know that summer is near. That's what I think Jesus is saying, and how the definite article is being used there. I know I titled this webinar, The Fig Tree Revisited, which maybe is a misnomer. It's not, well, unless you understand the in the generic sense I'm describing. But yeah, I don't think it's that fig tree in Mark 11, but it is worth considering. I mean, it's, if you want to just kind of go through the New Testament, how did Jesus interact with fig trees? It's Mark 11, of course, we went through, but Mark 13 is just a kind of a stand-in here, although we've got a parable in Luke 13 as well. So you may spend some time on that if you want. Certainly there's some agricultural background to understand here. But what Jesus is saying at the level of meaning, he's going to elaborate in verse 29, because after all, this is a parable. And generally speaking, with parables, what Jesus is trying to do is to teach a lesson, and not necessarily, I mean, if he wants to, if he tells you he's teaching you a lesson from the fig tree or around the fig tree, or uses the word parable, you're clued in that you're not going to get like a biology lecture. That's not why Jesus is mentioning this. And we just read on to see this, that thus you also. So this is going to be an analogy. But I do think we ought to consider this word parable here in translation, tain parabolein. If you triple click that and see it in BDAG, these are some helpful definitions. Of course, the translation equivalent is parable. You see it in the transliteration there, parabolein. And so this may not require a whole lot of thought as far as you're concerned. You might just say, consider, from the fig tree, learn this parable. Although mathete, you would maybe also want to look, is mathete with parable, do those words occur together? And because of the learn here, mathete, it's not like hear this parable, it's learn. I personally favor learn this lesson, but it is a parable. And when we ask the question, what again is a parable, BDAG has this great definition. I've put this in your handout here. It's a narrative or saying of varying length, and this is very short length, we have some longer ones, designed to illustrate a truth, hence mathete, learn, especially through comparison, hutos, kai, humes, you also, or simile. So that's what's happening here. Strauss in Zondervan Exegetical Commentary notes that the term parable has a much wider range of meanings in Greek than in English, and that Mark has used the term for a variety of figures of speech, from analogies to proverbs to true parables. And when, maybe you don't like that terminology, when Strauss says true parables, he means how you would use that in a more colloquial, faith-based setting. If you say parable to somebody, Jesus told parables, we tend to think about longer stories. He's just specifying there are other ways, like Mark 7:17, for example, which we had, where he says, his disciples asked him the parable, or they asked him about the parable. And going back, it's very short what he has described. In fact, this is not even a story per se. It's not the beginning, middle, and an end. Here's your cast of characters. Here's your plot. It's more of an aphorism. And then parable is what's used to describe that. So I think that's what Strauss is getting at when he says that Mark, even just Mark, has used this term for a wide variety of there's a wide variety of ways to translate it. But I don't think this is a translation decision to spend a whole lot of time on. Parable, lesson, object, lesson, illustration. I think any of those would work as translation equivalents. And you could spend some time looking at your translations if you wanted to see how others do that. We'll stop for questions in just a moment, but let me just note too that this hatan ede is something like when already. I think the NIV, I follow their translation, which I think is more elegant, as soon as. When already its branch becomes tender, but it has that quality of, in the moment that you see the tender branch, that's how you know that summer is near. I'll just note too that amongst this talk about a parable and this being a parable, there is a sign that is pointing to a truth. And the sign is a tender branch on the fig tree and leaves coming out on the fig tree, on the branch. And the larger truth that points to is, yes, that the branch is tender, yes, that there are leaves, yes, that this is a beautiful fig tree, but it's a sign that the summer is near. So Jesus doesn't use the word sign here, but this whole chapter is about signs. I mean, I think probably everybody ever could agree on at least that much in Mark 13. It's about signs. A thing that happens or things that happen, these things we'll see again today, that point to something else, almost that are precursors or that they're announcements or they're indications that something is coming. And so Jesus uses the word parable, and so we've got a parable, and it has to do with a sign. We're going to get this more in verse 29 because he's going to essentially explain the parable or the saying or the object lesson, however you decided to translate it. But that's verse 28. From the fig tree, learn the lesson or this parable. As soon as its branch becomes tender and it puts out its leaves, you know that the summer is near. And again, this would be something that everybody there would understand, the way that it's told. You know, genoskete, that's the main verb. You already know. And so Jesus is just starting from something known. Now he's about to move to something that is not known. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But let me check with you and see comments or questions that you've got. Yeah, here's a comment in the chat. I'll just put this in for everyone to see. Someone says same topic, Tain Sukein, Kai Panta, Tadendra, Luke 21:29. Yeah, I do think, whether you feel like you would need to do this for translation or not, I think just the study of the fig tree in general is interesting. Not just I think the biological piece, the ecological piece is important, and because I don't know how that works, I need to research it. I'm not in the first century Palestine there. But I think also, how is it used? Like, how does it get used, metaphorically? What does it stand for? And somebody asked the question, isn't a fig tree in the Old Testament sometimes a symbol of Israel, the nation? And so to answer that question, I would just search that in the Septuagint, which you can go right to search in, as I trust you know. That will default to the lexical form, and then I might just open up an NETS or some parallel to look at that. Of course, we have the fig tree right in Genesis 3, so it comes up right away, but you could go through this and look at that to get a good answer to that question. You could also do a within search to see if you get Israel or Jerusalem or some stand-in for that. So that's a great question and certainly connected to this. Any other comments or questions on verse 28? All right, well, this is like part A of, I mean, really these verses go together. So here's part B, here's the payoff, hutos, the thus, therefore, here's the payoff, here's the implication, here's why I'm mentioning the fig tree. Hutos kai humes, so thus also you, hatan, and then you see a match, there's hatan. Whenever idete, you see, tauta genomena, whenever you see these things happening, genoskete, hati engus estin epi thurais. You know that near is, or he is near the door. We'll come back to genoskete in a minute. You can see in the instant details that this same exact inflection or the same spelling within the accent mark and everything is parsed here as present active indicative. That's in 28. Now in 29, it's giving us present active imperative. We'll come back to that. So the question is, what do you see whenever you see tauta genomena, whenever you see these things happening? So again, you see something. Now, this is interesting. Jesus doesn't actually say, I mean, there's not an exact lexical, word parallelism. Jesus doesn't say, as soon as you see its branch, but it's implied. In the same way that that's a sign that somewhere is near. Now, here's something else you're going to see that's a sign, namely these things happening. That's the sign. And then the sign, the greater thing, reality that it points to is that he is near, right at the door. Now, this sentence by itself, and certainly out of context, is not, I would not consider it abundantly clear. I would also not consider my translation abundantly clear. But I do think that if there's ambiguity in the Greek text, and if it's possible to retain it in the English text as a way of honoring the Greek text, explaining as much as is necessary, and that's a balance, easier said than done, I think. But I do favor that kind of approach, which is why my translation is not filling out what these things might be, or that he is near. Now, we don't have to scroll up very far to get the referent for the he, the estin. That will be the Son of Man, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But just note at the grammatical level, what do you see? Well, there's that would we would expect an accusative here, and that's the object of the seeing. And so we've got a neuter plural accusative, tauta, which can be used in any number of ways. It could even mean like a collective stuff, but these things is a good way to translate it, even though the word things per se is not there. The neuter plural tauta means these things. And then genomena is a participle, also plural accusative from genomai, because it matches tauta, because what you're seeing is these things happening. And because it's what you're seeing, they're both accusative. They're the object of the verb. Let's get back to genoskete. Same verb as 28, and that's to complete the analogy. Again, you see something, it's a sign, and so you know something else, some other reality that the sign has tipped you off to. And so there's a tight link at the word level there. Genoskete hati engus, in fact, it's more than just genoskete, because you've got hati engus. Now, here's where it's both exactly the same phrasing, but where it moves from, the kind of stand-in object lesson to the thing that Jesus wants to say more explicitly. This genoskete is understood as an imperative. I don't think it's every translation, but I do want to point out the NET note, which I put into your handout in verse 29. And so again, it's the same exact spelling. The footnote here says, again, this is in your handout, the verb genoskete can be parsed as either present indicative or present imperative. In this context, the imperative fits better since the movement is from analogy, trees and seasons, to the future, the signs of the coming of the kingdom. Now, this verse doesn't use the word kingdom, but that's how the NET is reading it. And since the emphasis is on preparation for this event. So in other words, whatever else we think about what and when Mark is referring to, this idea of watching out, beware, be ready, which we come back to right here. You can see it in this nice subheading here. That is part and parcel of Mark 13. So it makes sense context-wise that a verb that could be parsed either way would be imperative here. And you know, you could ask the question, well, does that mean we should read 28 as an imperative? And you know, you could try that. I mean, the spelling alone is not going to tell you. And that would be something like, whenever its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, know that summer is near. I mean, yeah, I suppose that's fine. That would work. But I think the idea is they already know that. That's not new information. So that's why that's parsed here as indicative and translated that way often. And then I think here, the idea is this hatan has to do with, it's more future looking. In fact, even here, the hatan ede, when already, that's sort of like a when that has already happened. Like when you see that it's already become clear. So now what you're looking at is past tense. This hatan, even though it's the same word, is future looking. And again, this may be over explanation. Everyone may look at this context and think, well, yeah, obviously this is talking about the future. So if you read it that way, genoskete being an imperative makes a lot more sense than it being an indicative. I don't think you could really translate this. I guess you could. So also you, when you see these things happening, you know that he is near, right at the door. You could do that. I think the imperative makes a little more sense, but well worth looking at your translations, making sure you've got verse lookup selected. Click on the verse. You might even just go to modern texts. Yeah, you've got know ye in the ASV, know that in Berean. Now here's all that, and here's the Common English Bible. When you see these things happening, you know that he's near. So they take that as the indicative. So does the CNT. You'll find that your mileage will vary here, but regardless, and I don't think the most important part of this verse is whether you translate this as indicative or imperative. In fact, either way still works with the future looking set of signs and an event. Note too that in verse 28 we had engus estin, is near. That had an explicit subject. Let me close this and go back to verse 28. In fact, let me open up the diagrams will help here. Okay, verse 28, you know that ta theros, the summer is near. So is near has a subject. What is near? The summer. Whereas in verse 28, and you can notice here, I know this is a little small on my screen, but look at this and this. I mean, they're structurally identical with the exception of you've got a null subject here, which is to say a subject that's implied or encoded in the verb estin, near. So know that something, someone is near. This estin, you see it up here, it can take a neuter subject. So it could be know that it is near, at least at a grammatical level. But I think generally speaking, you're going to find as you go on, it's not just near, but it's right at the door. I mean, that does seem to be speaking about a person, and we're not that far away from the Son of Man arriving. And so what we're getting in verse 29 is when you see these things happening, know that he is about to arrive. And then we get an image here right at the door. He is near, right at the door. I did not look for a lot of different interpretations of this verse. I would imagine at least one interpretation somewhere takes this engus estin as it is near, because again, grammatically you can do that. And this is where translation is, I apologize if this sounds like a broken record, but translation sometimes is one-to-one, often it's not. And this is a great example where with genoskete, you know how to translate that word, but the context determines which of two options it is. Same here with engus, which is, I think it was France who points this out. It's an adverb. This doesn't have gender, so it doesn't specify whether it's neuter or masculine or feminine for that matter. So the Estin, which could be any of those, just isn't clarified. But again, I think generally speaking on the balance, you're going to find a he provided here in translation. That's how I read it. If you read it differently, I'd love to hear about that in the chat. And then that raises the question of who's the he, and the closest referent would be the Son of Man. But let me pause there because I want to just kind of dip a little bit more into those questions, but I see some questions here in the questions box, and I want to take those before we move on. So let me just leave the verse up here, verse 29, which again, not the most difficult Greek that we've seen in Mark. Thus, you also, whenever you see these things happening, know that he is near, right at the door. So, not the hardest to translate that we've had, but raises lots of questions. We'll get into those briefly in a minute. Let me take this comment and I'll put it in the chat and then read it. So somebody says, is parable the best translation here? Perhaps comparison is more accurate in light of what Jesus says in the rest of this section. Yeah, that's great. So, and I'll get to the rest of the comment in a minute. So then you'd be translating it as, from the fig tree, learn this comparison. You may need to massage mathete in that case, but the word parable, this comment continues, sometimes alerts me to various figures that mean something else than the literal words, such as sower, seed, various places to plant seeds. Interesting. Yeah, that's a great comment. And again, I think depending on the amount of time available to you, this certainly warrants further research, especially I would be curious to know when parabolane is in the accusative case. So when it's something that although if you akuo it would be in the genitive case. So what I would like to do to research this further is just see what verbs are used with the parable. You're going to get things like, he told them this parable, hear this parable, understand this parable. But I would do that as a point of kind of understanding just what parables are and how people are expected to interact with them. So I think a simple within search is there. But yes, to the question of, is comparison a good way of understanding it? I think the BDAG definition is so helpful here. I think you might want to consider, is the comparison a subset of something slightly larger, like a saying or an aphorism, and it contains a comparison? But yes, I think that's a great suggestion, and I really appreciate the BDAG entry here, because parable it's a hard, for me, it's a hard word to define just in English. I'm just so used to it. I just think, well, it's a story Jesus told, and that's true, but that leaves out a lot of what a parable can be. A great comment and question. Thanks for that. Yeah, okay, good. Here's another, yes. And I would love to hear folks' thoughts on this, and I will do my best. I don't think I had a note on this, but somebody says, yeah, this phrase epithourais is interesting here. And so this, again, in a chapter with so many questions, we really want to let it speak for itself. And so when it does, we want to pay attention. And so here, this is a good example of that. That, this is verse 28, that the summer is near. So what you've got here is, that a subject is near. And what we've got in verse 29, that a subject not defined is near, but we get this add-on here, epithourais. So that does give us more information that we're going to want to look at. And so there are a couple steps here, I think. One is to look at this preposition. Here it's used with the dative. And so you're going to get a really long article on epi. And in fact, it can be used, I mean, this is the preposition on the vocabulary cards that I always forgot, because it can have like 8 different answers. I mean, you can see that here in BDAG. But BDAG has a scripture for it. And I trust folks know that if you don't already have that set up in your settings under Amplify, you want include reference when amplifying from text to tool. So when I triple click a Greek word to get it in my preferred lexicon, it looks up the word and. If there's a reference, it surfaces it. 2 exact hits, go down by hit to get right there. Now, this is part of a long article, so I may want to expand this out. But here, if we scroll up, marker of presence or occurrence near an object or area. So at or near is what it gives for translation equivalence. And it lists Mark 13:29. So we could render it as know that he is here, or he is near the door. That's redundant. So you might follow something like, I think it was the NASB that has right at the door. I did that here. And in the NASB, they always put in italics words that are not actually in the Greek text, but I think that brings out the meaning there. If you have other comments or questions about that phrase, I'd love to hear them and share them with others. It does make me want to, and we won't do this now, but it does make me want to ask whoever is near is at the door. So I would maybe look at who is described as at the door in Mark and in the Greek New Testament. And it's interesting, if we read this as the he being the Son of Man, we've got a really different spatial location, whether literal or metaphorical or some combination, for the Son of Man to be. I mean, in verse, let me just get an English translation here. I mean, here, again, provided that he is near is talking about the Son of Man, which is the closest reference. I mean, I would say with as high a degree of certainty as possible that this is not referring back to the fig tree. It's not saying when you see these things happening, know that the fig tree is near right at the door. That just doesn't make sense to me. So let's say it's the Son of Man. He is here right at the door. Well, the last time we had the Son of Man, he was arriving in the clouds with great power and glory. He was sending the angels, gathering his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. And again, however we read these spatial metaphors, and heaven is often described, I think someone had a comment about this last time, as being up there. And yes, you have Jesus ascending into heaven, but heaven isn't really up there per se. As somebody made the comment, think of it like another dimension. Anyway, however you think about that, whatever combination of metaphorical, physical, these are like ends of the earth kind of words, very celestial, ethereal, very cosmic, with the Son of Man arriving. Again, however you interpret that, that's the language. And now here in verse 29, you get right at the door. So again, provided that this is he, that this is the Son of Man. I mean, there's a huge shift here in the imagery. Whenever this happens and whatever exactly it is, just at the language level, it's a really big shift. If you were to think of a headline, it would be like from the clouds to your front door. And I think there's probably, I mean, you'd want to look at this word yourself, but I think there's an immediacy, an urgency implied here. Like, I can't get to the clouds. Well, I can in an airplane, but then you certainly couldn't. This power and glory, I can't just kind of go there. I can't just kind of go track down an angel, the four winds, all that, but I can go answer my door. So there's an immediacy there, there's an accessibility, and there's an urgency, because what do you do if someone is at your door? You respond. And in fact, you can go further culturally. I mean, think about hospitality. Maybe depending on your cultural tradition, maybe that knock at your door turns into an hour-and-a-half meal, or a cup of coffee, or just come in and sit down. Can I get you something to drink? Here's some water, 5 minutes, or whatever it is, but you respond either way. So this, I think, as much as I've thought about this chapter and considered it over the years, this really stands out to me this time. And I think I think there's some tie into this whole be ready, because it's talking about this ethereal stuff, again, however that's read, but the payoff is for you. I mean, you're going to have to get up and answer the door because he's there. And Jesus doesn't explicitly say that, but at the level of imagery, we get very immediate and urgent. There's like a call to action, which we've actually seen already and we'll see again. in the end. You don't know when he's going to come back. So even here in verse 32 through 37, the owner of the house will return. He might find you asleep. I mean, this is, you can imagine that the owner is going to come back and knock on the door or walk in the door. So we'll revisit this, but I think in some ways, 32 through 37, in fact, we even have a doorkeeper here. Look at that. I think 32 through 37 will elaborate on this door. So I'll stop there. I don't want to overly pontificate, but I do think it's just worth noticing at the level of metaphor and imagery what Mark and Jesus are doing here. I think there's really an immediacy that is being brought to mind here. I see the comment about this being in the plural. Yeah, so right. So I guess I think of like how the Sabbath is used in the plural. And I wonder if BDAG speaks this, but you've got Sabbath used that way. Well, this tells us what we're seeing. It doesn't say why, but BDAG says right here, the plural can be used of one door. And I might wonder, why not just use the singular, which is also my question about the Sabbath. Why is the Sabbath often used in the plural to refer to one day? And I know I've seen answers to that before. If you have them, would love if you share them in the chat. You might even, I mean, if that's enough of a curiosity to you, you might even just go to your research and see if you get, I would look in your grammars and even see if your grammars have something. Yeah, I mean, idiom is probably the word here, but yes, so this would come up in your grammar. So I would search this word, just copy and paste it from the text, and that would be worth looking, because yeah, the why question, why is it in the plural? I mean, I suppose in theory, you could read it as he is near right at all of your doors, but I think the immediacy, and again, it's imagery that is meant to evoke whatever reality Jesus is describing. I think I would go with the door plural. I'm just going to raise this question again. Tauta, these things, which things? Which is, I think we've probably asked that question every time. Thus, you also. We didn't really look at who the you is, but we've talked about that a couple times in the discourse. Who's Jesus addressing? Whenever you see these things happening, know that he is near, right at the door. So if the event that the signs are pointing to is that he, presumably the Son of Man, is near, what are the signs? Well, the signs are these things happening. This is the disciples' question from the very beginning. And I think that I'll at least surface that the next closest referent to these things is last week's passage. All of these things, especially verses 26, I said 24 and 25. So we get these things that are essentially signs: suffering, sun darkened, moon not giving its light, stars falling, powers in heaven. And then they point to what's about to happen, which is the Son of Man arriving in the clouds. So I would begin here with identifying a referent for Tauta here in these previous verses, but that doesn't mean, I mean, I'm not looking at that and saying, therefore I know with great certainty that these things refers back to these verses. Some interpretations say that, others don't. And that's what we've looked at before. So I will just stop there for now, check in with you. I have some more comment on these things that I've put in your handout that we can go to, because Jesus comes back to it here. So we're not quite done with it. But again, to reiterate what I said before, this is an ambiguity that I'm actually happy. Well, to me, it's an ambiguity. It may not be to you, but I'm happy to preserve this in English translation. In other words, I'm not going to, I think it's over translating to say, thus you also, whenever you see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, know that he is near, right at the door. Even if you're, fairly certain that's right, I think tauta genomena is in the text, translate these things happening. And then, ours is still the task of kind of figuring out what exactly is going on. Okay, here's a comment. I'll put this here. Someone says, plural singular collection of doors at the door of each of us. Personal at my door, even though that door is part of a collection of door of other people's lives. All right, thanks for that. Yeah, and of course I think about, do we want to bring Revelation 3 into this text. I mean, maybe, maybe not. I think there's something to be said for doing something like biblical theology or even just hermeneutics in broader context. So, you know, we want to be faithful to what Mark is about, but you've got, I mean, it's hard for me not to think about this, where in 3:20 Revelation, Jesus says, and I'm wondering what the actual referent is. It the word Jesus or the I am? But you'd have to look at that. But I am standing at the door and knocking. So there's a very personalized component to that. So whether that applies to Mark 13 or not, that's another question you'd want to ask. But as you search for this word, thura, and that will give it to you, by the way, it should give it to you in both singular and plural. So you'll see all uses of it, and you can start to understand how is door used. Certainly you want to see, does Mark use it elsewhere? I think he's got people standing at the door at some point. Yeah, actually a couple times. So these are pretty literal historical doors, but yeah, you could consider if you want to look at other passages too. All right, let's move into verse 30 and 31. Jesus goes on again, mercifully straightforward Greek, I think. Amen lego humin, truly I say to you, hati u me parelthe, hegenea haute. Truly I say to you that surely not, ume, that double negative is emphatic, will pass away. Of course, we've got the aorist, more on that in a minute. This generation, mekris hu tauta panta genetai. Surely this generation will not pass away until the who is something like such a time as when these things, all these things happen. So I've got, truly I tell you that this generation will surely not pass away until all these things happen. You may wonder about this parelthe, this aorist, being translated with a future tense. When we say in like a first year grammar textbook that the aorist is past, that is generally true, but not always true. It has more to do with viewpoint, and certainly this is future looking. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any translation that is, I mean, I guess you could say something like this generation will not have passed away, if you want some remnant of the past tense there, but the aorist is more the perspective there. So truly I tell you, this generation will surely not pass away until all these things happen. Now, you don't need me to tell you that this is another verse that has caused lots of ink and ones and O's and people typing out and asking and conversing about what does this mean? Who is this generation? We'll come to that in just a minute. I want to just notice the amen lego at the beginning. Truly I tell you, that's got the rhetorical effect of I mean it, or indeed. I don't think this has to be the case, but generally speaking, if you search this phrase, often what follows can be hard to believe, hence the qualifier. If you think colloquially, you might say, you're not going to believe what happened to me today, and then you tell a story. Now, you're not actually saying that you don't think the person's going to believe you. Maybe you are. What you're saying is what happened is unbelievable. It's hard to believe. It strains credulity. But rhetorically, what you're doing is highlighting the kind of intense, extreme, challenging to believe nature of what you're about to say. So you could think about amen lego humin as that. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the King James. And you confirm this for yourself. But if you word search this, you'll see that typically what follows is something that is not the easiest or most natural the most comfortable thing to hear. And you can kind of verify that on your own if you want. So however you translate that, truly I tell you, or listen to this, or I really mean it, I tend to favor the more straight up kind of almost wooden truly I tell you, but I think that captures the nuance well. So who is this generation? Well, I've said we'll spend some time looking into this at the webinar. We may revisit this, but the first question is, what does Genea mean? So I would go to lexicons. I would look at usage in Mark and in the Greek New Testament. I would see what is the full range of meaning of this word. What can it mean in general? And in other words, what are the limits of its meaning? And then I would look at commentaries. Now, I think if you were to just kind of poll a person on the street and give them this phrase and say, what is this talking about? I would imagine most folks would say this generation. This would be like the one you can almost imagine Jesus gesturing about to who's there. So this generation, meaning the one that's there in the first century, in the moment that he's saying this, 30, 31, 32 AD, 29 AD, whenever it is. And that generation, now when we use that word, we talk about, you know, boomers, Gen X, millennials, and so it's like a class of people that are alive right now. I think many people would understand it that way. Your commentaries will give you a full range of meaning and lots of different options for what could be at play with generation. And the reason why they do that, France talks about this really well. He talks about people not wanting to be embarrassed by Jesus if Jesus meant to say everyone around here in the first century won't die until all these things happen. And if Jesus meant all these things like some kind of second coming in great glory, if that's the interpretation, there's a concern then that Jesus is wrong or has mispredicted the future or something like that. And some commentators say that and have no problem with that. You may have theological commitments, faith commitments, or even just other like exegetically grounded commitments that prevent you from that reading. And so if that's the case, okay, what is generation? Maybe it means something else. Or what are all these things? That's the other direction people go, as we know. So at the risk of, I mean, I don't want to oversimplify this. I don't think it can be oversimplified, but SIL exegetical commentary, knowing that we're asking these questions, puts three different collections, summaries of interpretations under what are these things and who are the people of this generation who will not pass away. And we have talked about these things quite a bit. The question about this generation, I mean, we've got some options here. It could refer to the disciples who were alive while Jesus was speaking. And so if that's your starting point, what are all these things? That tends, especially for people who want to say that Jesus was not wrong and could not be wrong, that tends to locate all these things, excuse me, in the first century of Jerusalem. It is also possible, as you see in another interpretation, that this generation could refer to the whole human race, which you'd want to say, all right, well, that's fine, and maybe I'm okay with that that interpretation, but does Genea get used that way elsewhere? So you'd want to look that up. And then you've also got this type of generation, generation of wicked humanity, and then that would maybe get you beyond the current historical generation. So you may consider what's here. And again, I'm not here to convince you of one reading or the other. Maybe there are parts of each that appeal to you, but the reason for asking about the word Genea, and we didn't do any of this, but I would go to your lexicons. I would start with how Mark uses it. I would look at how the Greek New Testament uses it. I would look at a range of meaning and then look at the commentaries. Now, I would do it in that order, maybe even look at Mark's usage first. The question I think that first arises is, who is this generation? And even what does not pass away mean? I think folks generally read that as a natural death on earth. Could it mean something else? And then the other related question of all these things. Now, note that we had Tauta in 29, and here we have Tauta Panta. So another question, which I just raise, is does Tauta Panta possibly mean different things than just Tauta? So when you move from these things happening and then all these things, is that a sort of backing out more broadly, or is it the same these things? So it's easier for me, at least initially, to identify the questions and then kind of go after them and come up with some solutions or some proposed answers. Or maybe this is as far as you get. Maybe you're not certain and you think, well, it could mean this, it could mean that. Bringing it back to translation, again, I just would preserve this, something like this. I tell you that this generation will surely not pass away until all these things happen. Now, if you're leading a Bible study about this, of course it's going to come up. So I would, you'd want to be prepared with having looked at some of these things here. But translation-wise, I don't, the Greek's not very complicated. I wouldn't try to import a particular interpretation into the translation. I would leave it like this, knowing that, that certainly will spark discussion. And then finally, I'll just do this briefly, and we'll leave the last couple minutes for questions. Jesus goes on, continuing this theme of surely not passing away. He says, ha uranas kai hege parelusantai, heaven and earth will pass away. Hoi de lagoi mu, but my words, u me parelusantai, will never pass away. Notice a repetition of u me parerkomai. That is the verb that's used here in the future tense. With Jesus's words will never pass away. You know what else will certainly never pass away? This generation, until all these things take place. Now that doesn't mean Jesus's words and this generation are on par, but there does seem to be some possible connection there. I just raised that for your consideration. As to which words of Jesus, again, here's the SIL Exegetical Summary Series, which I share just because it so quickly and concisely catalogs the different options, and you see them laid out here. It could mean all of his teachings. It could mean a subset of his teachings. It could mean a smaller subset of his teachings. But there is a certainty there, and it's going to be followed up by a call to action that's made explicit here in verses 32 through 37. But we'll stop there for now. I want to take any comments or questions that you have. I can stay on for another couple minutes past the hour. But Jesus concludes, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will surely not pass away. Let me see what you've got in terms of questions or comments. Yeah, it looks like I responded to this in real time. Somebody says, it is interesting that parelthe is translated as a future when it is actually an aorist passive and not a future verb in some form. Yeah, I think we could probably revisit that. I think that has to do with the, what you would call the aspectual nature, the aspect of it, rather than tense per se. Here's another comment. I'll put this in the text. Somebody says, I noticed Decker in his Greek grammar recommends BDAG abridged. For pastors with limited prep time, his recommendation might be very practical for research. Decker uses it several times over the full BDAG. Yeah, that's great. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was just released in accordance. And I want to say it's Danker's abridged, or Donker. And I have not used it a whole lot, but my understanding is that it is not only abridged, but that it actually has some differences from BDAG. So this Donker is the D in BDAG, but I'll put the link there in the chat, and that would be worth checking out. Let me just check in on other questions. Yeah, somebody says, why can't this generation mean the generation that sees the imminent sign of the Son of Man's coming? That's very interesting. Yeah, I think it certainly could. Yeah, I mean, there's no, I think what we want to try to rule out is any interpretations that, make the Greek do something it can't, or make the context do something it can't. But that fits with the context, whether you find it compelling for other reasons or not. But this generation would essentially be Jesus there, kind of flash forwarding into the scene of where the Son of Man's coming, and when he looks around at that scene, and it's that generation that he's talking about. That's a very interesting take. Yeah, here, let me take this comment here, 2 parts, putting it in your chat so you can see it. Somebody says the boundary for these things in verses 29 through 37 is at 24 and following, since 24 uses those pointing back at the tribulations, right? Yeah, we had some tauta already and variations thereof. This phrase is governed by the nearest context. This pronoun goes with these pronouns, passages of verses 24 through 27. comment says, this generation is the ones alive that physically see these things of 24 through 37. Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. Oh, somebody says, please explain the Max and married comment in the handout. Yeah, right. So this Mekris, who is, they kind of tease it out, and it's saying this generation will surely not pass away until the time which. And so the until which, so I think what they're just saying is to Kranu, that the time is implied in that. But really, I think until is enough for a translation. Mekris, who, this would be a good word to look at, Mekris and BDAG though. But yeah, that's what they're saying, is they're trying to take what they think may be a confusing two-word phrase, which it at least was for me, and explain, okay, what is this doing? It's just like in English, we don't always use the full phrases for things. Okay, interesting. Somebody looked at context in Matthew to look at what does this generation mean. Yeah, and thanks for that comment. And we'll wrap up with this. Yeah, somebody says this generation being Jewish people, national Israel. I mean, whether you agree with that interpretation or not, I think looking at Matthew 22 and parallels, I keep saying, and we will, at the bottom here, we will compare synoptic parallels. I think it's worth looking and seeing what you've got there that can shed some light on this. But we'll stop there. We'll continue on with this chapter. We are almost at the end of Mark 13. I think we'll just pick up with 32 next time. And yeah, I would just say, I know we went over this quickly and this deserves a lot of time, but here on page 4, these things, and who is this generation, that's worth checking out. And if you happen to have SIL exegetical commentary, I'll just note this as we close. Everything, or not everything, but a lot of things are hyperlinked here. So you can get right into the relevant commentaries that it mentions. And if you've got them in your library, it'll just pop right up and take you there. So that can be a good springboard. I'm going to end the recording and then do just one last bit of housekeeping. But if you're watching the recording, thanks so much for being here. Find the handout at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. And let me stop the recording. Thanks for watching, everyone.